Good day. Today is Thursday, 16th January 2025. Just a few hours ago, I did a program in which I discussed the pressure that Donald Trump's team was exerting upon the Israelis to agree a ceasefire deal over the conflict in Gaza. And sure enough, a few hours later, reports started to appear with statements from Donald Trump and Joe Biden and others, and also, by the way, statements from the government of Iran, all of which confirmed that a ceasefire deal had indeed been reached. Now, the terms of this ceasefire deal have not yet been made public, or at least if they have, I haven't yet seen them. But what I understand that ceasefire deal basically involves is that there's supposed to be a 42-day process. Over the course of that period, Hamas is required to release all of the remaining hostages that remain under its control. There are varying numbers, as far as I can see, about how many of these people there actually are, and also apparently to provide the remains of any hostages who have died whilst in Hamas's hands. The Israelis, for their part, are also required to release thousands of Palestinian prisoners. I am not quite sure which prisoners, whether these are prisoners that Israel took captive over the course of the Gaza operation, or whether they are prisoners that Israel had already taken prisoner before the 7th of October 2023, when Hamas launched its attack on Israel. Now, the distinction is important, at least to some extent, because one of the justifications that Hamas has provided for the 7th October 2023 attack is that it was seeking to take Israelis hostage in order to compel Israel to release Palestinian prisoners. Now, whether that is indeed what has happened or what is going to happen, I am not sure. I'm going to say that to some extent, quite plausibly, we have now moved beyond the position where that kind of trade has any political significance, though it's perhaps worth remembering that that was what Hamas initially said it had intended to do. Anyway, so there's supposed to be a release by Hamas of the Israeli hostages and an release by Israel of Palestinian prisoners in return. Now, there has also been an agreement that Israel will undertake a phased withdrawal of its forces from Gaza. There have been various proposals, discussions within Israel itself about Israel establishing buffer zones in northern Gaza, maintaining troops in Gaza, about Israel driving out Palestinians from northern Gaza, which might be repopulated by Israeli settlers. There were even proposals at one time that the entire population of Gaza leave Gaza and be replaced eventually by Israeli settlers. I'm sorry to say that such proposals absolutely did exist. One can find them if one looks hard enough in the Israeli media. But none of that apparently is going to happen, thankfully. Instead, we're going to get, or so the agreement requires, a phased withdrawal of all Israeli troops from Gaza. Hamas has insisted on this. They've never wavered on this demand. They have compromised to some extent. They've accepted that the Israeli withdrawal will be a phased withdrawal rather than an immediate one. But on the principle of an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, they have remained unwavering. So, an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. let me stress, this is, as I understand it, what the proposal sets out. And of course, there is to be a ceasefire. And I'm not certain what the duration of the ceasefire is meant to be, but my understanding is that this is an indefinite ceasefire. Now, the Biden administration, Biden himself, are apparently saying that in essence this is a document, this ceasefire agreement is identical to a document that had almost been agreed back in May 2024. And I'm sure that that is true. And I'm going to go further, and I'm going to say that, in my opinion, it is highly likely that if there had been any serious intention on the part of the Biden administration and the Israelis to reach a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, this agreement could also have been agreed much earlier in exactly the terms that we see now. I would venture a guess that we could have had an agreement in all respects identical to this one in February last year. In other words, a year of fighting has taken place. Thousands, probably tens of thousands of people have died. Most of them, many of them, civilians, some of them children, apparently large numbers of children. Property damage on a colossal scale in Gaza could have been avoided. A humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza could have been avoided. All of that might have happened and could have been almost certainly agreed a year ago. But instead, we have had a year of sometimes intense, sometimes sporadic fighting, and it has brought us precisely to that place where we could have been without any of that fighting taking place. Now, Iran, the Iranian media, and Hamas itself are hailing this as a victory. And in a certain political sense, one can understand why. If we go back to the events of 7th October 2023, the Hamas attack on Gaza, I remember appearing on a discussion program on X Spaces, hosted by David Sachs, who is now, of course, a member, or soon will be a member, at least in some form, of the Trump administration. Elon Musk also participated in that discussion, as did Vivek Ramaswamy. It's the only occasion, by the way, I've ever had any contact with those two gentlemen. And I remember that Daniel Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis of the US Army, he was also on that program. And he has been to Gaza, and he has said that in his opinion, and this, by the way, was after the events of 7th October 2023, but before the Israeli military operation in Gaza began. I remember Daniel Davis, who I did not know until then. I'd not had any direct contact with him up to that point. Anyway, I remember him saying on that program that he had been to Gaza. He was aware of the situation there. He knew the layout of the city. He knew about the underground networks that Hamas had been created. And he thought that an operation by Israel to advance into Gaza, to launch a military operation to clear out Hamas, that would be a disastrous idea, that Hamas was too deeply embedded in Gaza, that it was too well organized and too well supported to be destroyed or defeated in that sort of way. Israel would be involved in a prolonged and disastrous war in Gaza. Thousands of people would die, and nothing would be achieved because the objective, the stated objective, to destroy Hamas through that kind of operation, that sort of objective was unachievable. Now, that was the opinion of Daniel Davis, US military officer. That was the view that he held then. And, well, it seems to me that we can see that he has been proved completely right. Now, on various programs that we have done on the Duran, we have also had the privilege of hosting Alistair Crook, former British diplomat, person who knows Hamas, who knows the Israelis, who knows all the major players in the Middle East, man of immense experience in Middle Eastern matters. He too has been to Gaza. He too was familiar with the Hamas leadership. He knows the region very well, and he too came from a different perspective, because he's not a military man, to exactly the same opinion that Daniel Davis did. Though, as far as I know, the two men don't know each other. He too said that an Israeli military operation in Gaza would fail to achieve its stated objective, which was the destruction of Hamas. He too has been proved absolutely correct. And for myself, I repeatedly pointed out, citing comments made during the Vietnam War by none other than Henry Kissinger, that in a situation such as the one that Israel faced, when Israel was in a sense seeking to defeat an organization like Hamas, which amongst many other things has to be seen also as a resistance movement. In that kind of situation, if the resistance movement is not destroyed, if it survives, then it has won. That was what Henry Kissinger in the 1960s said about the Viet Cong in Vietnam. It seemed to me that it applied equally to Hamas in Gaza, and exactly as Daniel Davis and Alistair Crook predicted, that is exactly the situation today which we appear to be in. And in fact, we have recently had articles in the Israeli media which have now been taken up, and the same story has been published in the Wall Street Journal, which essentially tell us the same thing, that Hamas has survived. It is still present in Gaza. It is still a force in being. In fact, it has reorganized, reinforced, it has absorbed the losses, it has recruited new fighters, it has re-equipped, it has reorganized its leadership, with its new leader being Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the 7th October operation, whom the Israelis, of course, killed. So, if the objective was the destruction of Hamas, then the Israeli operation, as of today, appears to have failed. And if this is the terms of the ceasefire deal, which I presume they are, and if the ceasefire deal sticks, then Hamas can and will claim that it has achieved a victory. It is a victory paid at a grisly price by the Palestinian population in Gaza, but it is a victory which has now conclusively established Hamas as the leading resistance force on the Palestinian territories, amongst the Palestinian people, and which has also put the issue of Palestine once again center stage in the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is what I suspect Yahya Sinwar, and other Hamas officials had always intended when they planned and launched their operation on 7th October 2023. Well, that's the situation that we are in. Now, entirely understandably, whilst there is celebration, and I don't think that's too strong a word, some degree of celebration about this outcome on the part of Hamas and in Iran, and the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has made statements hailing the victory that Hamas and the axis of resistance have supposedly achieved. And the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, has also issued similar statements. Unsurprisingly, in Israel, the feeling is completely different. As I make this program, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has doggedly persisted in this military operation in Gaza, he apparently is saying that Hamas has backtracked on some of the terms of the ceasefire agreement. He's not, for that reason, prepared to put it before the Israeli cabinet. There's no word yet as to when the Israeli cabinet will vote on this agreement, though most assume that at some point Netanyahu will reverse and will put this agreement to the cabinet. Now, it is possible that some people in Hamas have taken advantage of the ceasefire agreement. They've manipulated it in some way. They've done various things that the agreement requires them not to do. Since I don't know the full text of the agreement, and I'm not in Gaza, and I don't know what the situation is there, I cannot say. But my strong guess is that the real reason why Prime Minister Netanyahu is not prepared so far to put this agreement to the Israeli cabinet is because within Israel it is controversial. And it is controversial for the same reason that it has been well received, indeed celebrated, by Hamas and by Iran, which is that the objective that was supposedly set back in October 2023, the destruction of Hamas, has not been achieved. And there are now reports that the hardline figures within the Israeli cabinet, led by the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, are apparently pushing back hard against the agreement. There is a possibility that Smotrich and Ben Gvir will vote against ratification of the agreement at the Israeli cabinet. They do not have a majority. The cabinet almost certainly will endorse it. But they have said, or at least Smotrich has threatened, that if that happens, if, as Smotrich somewhat incredibly says, the ceasefire means that the war in Gaza is at an end, if that is indeed the case, he says that he and his party will walk out of Netanyahu's coalition government. And again, it's not difficult to understand why. The objective to destroy Hamas has not been achieved, and well, it's hardly controversial that people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir most definitely do want some of these extreme outcomes that have been discussed in Israel in relation to Gaza, removal of populations, resettlement by Israeli settlers, all that sort of thing to be put into effect. and they are obviously going to be opposed to an agreement that rules those sort of terrible ideas out. Well, my own view, nonetheless, is that the Israeli cabinet will ratify this agreement. I understand that if Smotrich pulls out of the government, then the government will not actually fall. It will lose its majority in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, wily operator that he is, apparently has no shortage of other potential coalition partners, and it is likely that he'll be able to cobble together a new coalition which will nonetheless give him a majority, which will enable him to stay Prime Minister of Israel. Now, having said that, it is therefore Netanyahu's decision. He has to weigh very carefully what he's going to do from this point on. If he walks back on this agreement that has just been made, he will infuriate Donald Trump. And I've done 2 programs now on this channel, and we've had a cascade of evidence, all of which confirm that Donald Trump has issues with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They're not the friends that they once were, that Trump absolutely insists upon a ceasefire in Gaza. It is Trump's insistence on a ceasefire in Gaza. It is the way that Trump and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, basically gate-crashed the negotiations in Doha. That has brought us to the point where we have an agreement now. And as I've discussed in previous programs, as we have also discussed, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran, it's quite clear that Netanyahu doesn't want to get on the wrong side of Donald Trump. He no doubt feels that Israel's position and his own is too fragile for him to risk that now that there is a strong and purposeful president in the White House replacing a weak and ineffectual one. So Netanyahu needs to make a decision. Does he choose between Smotrich and Trump? Does he antagonize Smotrich or does he antagonize Trump? Now, it may be, first of all, that Smotrich is bluffing, that Smotrich does not really intend to go into opposition. Why would he want to? After all, he is the finance minister. I doubt that he particularly is interested in finance matters. But he and the radical group that he represents within Israeli politics have now gained control of key Israeli ministries. They've been able to insert their people into the Israeli state. Ben Gvir has been increasingly active in gaining control of much of Israel's internal security mechanisms, the uniformed police, and people like that. It may be that Smotrich, even if he hates this agreement, might conclude that his interests, the interests of the groups that he represents, are best served with it by staying within the government and by promoting this process of radicalization still further. And that process of radicalization within Israeli society has gone very far. There was a very disturbing, in fact distressing article recently by the American journalist Seymour Hersh, in which Hersh spoke about the radicalization of the Israeli officer corps, much of which apparently is now recruited from families of Israeli settlers, and the way in which these radicalized officers in Gaza have been acting and the kind of orders that they have been giving to their men. I believe this report of Hirsch is true, incidentally, and it upset me, reading it upset me considerably. Anyway, it could be that Smotrich and Ben Gvir make the calculation that it's more in their interests to stay where they are, continue to occupy their ministries, and that is how they will pursue their agenda more successfully. So it may be that in reality, at this moment in time, Netanyahu doesn't need to worry too much about Smotrich and Ben Gvir. And as I said, it does seem that he does have alternative coalition partners that he could work with, though it's been suggested that by doing so, he would weaken his own personal position at the head of the government. Well, he has the choice now. Does he go with Smotrich and Ben Gvir, infuriating Donald Trump, persisting in a war in Gaza that has gone badly wrong? Or does he, on the contrary, break, if only to a certain degree, with Smotrich and Ben Gvir, accept the fact that many of his own supporters are going to be very unhappy with this agreement, but realizing that despite all of the claims, all the comments, the goading comments by Hamas and Iran, doing this deal ultimately is in Israel's and his own best interests. Well, I have absolutely no doubt in my own mind that he should take the second course. In any discussion of the Gaza crisis, it is very difficult, and I struggle with this myself, to contain anger and to avoid emotion. But let me just make a few points for Israelis, perhaps, to consider. The war in Gaza for Israel, in my opinion, has been a disaster. It has failed to result in the destruction of Hamas. On many previous programs, I have discussed the alternative course that Israel might have followed after the events of the 7th of October 2023, and which would have had for Israel a much better result. Israel could have gone to the Security Council. The Security Council, in the atmosphere of revulsion against Hamas that existed then, would quite plausibly have recognized Hamas as a terrorist organization, imposed Chapter 7 sanctions upon it, demanded the surrender of its leaders and the immediate release of its hostages. And with the authority of the Security Council behind it, Israel and the United States could have pressed forward, isolated Hamas in the Middle East amongst Arab governments, cut off its sources of financial and other supply, put pressure upon it, which would have led to the organization's eventual collapse. I have no doubt, I'm absolutely sure, that had that course been followed, that would have been the end outcome. And, well, it would certainly, anyway, have left Israel in a far stronger position than the one it is in today. So this war has been an absolute disaster. It has done untold damage to Israel's international reputation. It has in my opinion, led Israel into an abyss. Going back to the things that Alistair Crook and Daniel Davis were saying, both men basically have debated, especially Daniel Davis, how Israel, the only ways in which Israel could have achieved its objectives in Gaza using kinetic force. Those methods would have been beyond appalling. They would have gone beyond even the most terrible allegations that Israel is already facing in the proceedings that are currently underway in The Hague, in the International Court of Justice, and in the International Criminal Court. They would have been completely appalling. It is a matter of profound dismay, and it should be a matter of profound dismay and indeed shame for many people in Israel that over the last year, in pursuit of the impossible objective of destroying Hamas, Israel went as far in following that course of action as it did. But even then, we have not gone, thankfully, to the ultimate point, which is a relief. But consider the moral harm to Israeli society that has been done. And, well, if you don't care about those things, and I know that there are some people who don't, which bewilders and dismays me. Well, if you don't care about these things, consider that you now not only have court cases against Israel, you not only have protests against Israel in countries with which Israel could once look upon as friends, but you've had massive damage done to the Israeli economy. You've had dislocations of people within Israel itself. You've had missile strikes between Israel and Iran, and Israel and the Houthis in Yemen. You've had exhaustion within the IDF, the Israeli military, which must also be demoralized at its failure to achieve its objective, to succeed in its mission. You've had unrest and discontent within Israeli society. Surely it is now beyond time to call a stop. Well, there we are. We will see what Prime Minister Netanyahu does. As I said, I hope he doesn't let himself be goaded by what Iran and Hamas are saying. I have absolutely no doubt, none at all, that the correct thing for him to do is to call Smotrich's bluff, agree to the ceasefire, put it to the Israeli cabinet, get the cabinet to vote for it, and to put the ceasefire in effect and call this disaster, this moral, legal, humanitarian, political, and military disaster that has played out in Gaza to an end. Now, I've spoken about Prime Minister Netanyahu in many, many programs on this channel. I've spoken about the wrong decisions that he made back in October. I've spoken about the malign influence of people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who, if they are allowed to follow their course, will, in my opinion, lead Israel to ever greater disasters. But I have to say this, in my opinion, there is one individual who more than any other must bear responsibility for this tragedy. And that is the president, the current president of the United States. Because he, more than anyone else, should have understood the tensions within Israeli society, the effect on Israeli society of the events of the 7th of October 2023. But he also should have understood the wider interests of the United States and also the situation within the Arab world. And yet, incredibly, he put all that aside. He came to Israel in October 2023 and he handed to Prime Minister Netanyahu a blank check. A blank check whereby he basically told Prime Minister Netanyahu, do whatever you want, whatever you think right, and the United States will support you. Giving Prime Minister Netanyahu the equivalent of a blank check in the circumstances of October 2023, in the immediate aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th October, was guaranteed to result in the kind of military operation in Gaza which followed. Had the president paid any attention to the realities, had he been concerned with the realities, or if the president himself was incapable of understanding this, had his team, the people who were advising him, understood the realities properly, well, they would have understood the disaster, the folly that a military operation in Gaza was, and the greater folly of giving Prime Minister Netanyahu the blank check that would lead to that disaster with the results that we have seen. Well, it turns out that not only did the president and his team give Prime Minister Netanyahu a blank check, but even as they were spreading stories in the media, in the US media, about how annoyed and upset they were with Prime Minister Netanyahu, certain officials within the administration, including it appears increasingly, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, were busy doing everything they could to assist the most maximalist aspects of the Israeli policies in Gaza. So it seems that Tony Blinken and others repeatedly assisted the Israelis in obstructing every step towards achieving a ceasefire agreement. They always backed every step that the Israelis took to pull back from ceasefire agreements that they appeared to have reached. And it seems that Tony Blinken and others in the administration were also instrumental in trying to refocus the conflict on Iran and ultimately to expand the conflict into some kind of war between Israel and Iran. Something which would have taken the disaster we already have and would have compounded it 100-fold. I have no words, no language to express my feelings of revulsion and disgust at the way in which the administration has acted. Up to a certain point, I can understand Prime Minister Netanyahu profoundly, completely, though I disagree with him. I can even understand Ben Gvir and Smotrich. I've come across people like that several times in my life, and I understand where these people are coming from, even though I understand how dangerous they are and the extent to which they should be resisted. But we are talking about the administration in charge of the foreign policy of the United States, the country that has the most important role in preserving the stability of the international system. And they not only took the essential steps to make the war and the moral, legal, humanitarian disaster which we have just seen unfold, but they did nothing for a whole year to stop it happening. On the contrary, they worked continuously, as far as I can see, and from what the reports say, to expand and extend it. It took Donald Trump and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to basically gatecrash the negotiations in Doha, finally to bring this folly to a stop. There have been many bad administrations in the United States over the last couple of decades. There's been many times things done by the United States which I thought were profoundly wrong. But I've never seen anything that can quite compare to this. Anyway, I've expressed myself in perhaps stronger language than I generally like to do. I'm finding it difficult to control my emotions about this. The pictures that we see of Gaza tell their own story. I hope that this ceasefire does stick. I hope that Prime Minister Netanyahu, for once, makes the correct decision. And I hope that we can, from this moment on, start to move forward towards some kind of peace in the Middle East, though to be absolutely clear, that process has been made more complicated and more difficult than anyone could have conceived, say, 18 months ago. Anyway, there we are. That's what I intend to say about the situation now. There's much more that can be said about the Middle East, the Iran-Russia agreement, the situation in Syria, which increasingly, as it is clear to me, has replaced one problem for Israel with another, even worse one. But there's only so much time, and I intend to just leave it here. Let's turn to other matters. Now, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, 2 days ago gave a massive press conference, as he often does, at the start of the year, outlining the situation in the world and the most important issues for Russian foreign policy. He spoke, for example, about Russia's relations with Armenia, to which he took an emollient position, surprisingly so, given some recent actions by the Armenian government to conclude a strategic partnership with the United States and to explore membership of the EU. But of course, the most important things that he had to say concerned relations with the United States and potential discussions between the United States to address the problem of the conflict in Ukraine. And I was struck by how favourably Lavrov spoke about Donald Trump. These were the words that Lavrov used. As soon as Donald Trump assumes the presidency and articulates his final stance on Ukrainian matters, we will examine it. Presently, the discourse is largely preparatory, leading up to his inauguration and the commencement of substantive work. As Donald Trump himself remarked, these discussions are part of his preparation to take office. He recognizes the importance of moving into the Oval Office first. The conversations over the past year encompass multiple facets, notably the increasing reference to the realities on the ground is a development likely to be welcomed. Mike Waltz, who I understand is expected to become the National Security Advisor, alongside President Trump in a wide-ranging interview, highlighted the root causes of the conflict. Now, the Russians have repeatedly said that there can be no settlement of the crisis in Ukraine unless the root causes of the conflict are addressed, and the Russians have repeatedly complained that in the various statements, proposals, ideas that various people in the West have been floating, and even some others like the Brazilians and the Indians as well, the root causes of the conflict have not been addressed. And here is Lavrov saying that Trump and Waltz have finally grasped the root causes of the conflict and have highlighted them. So already from the Russians, this is a significant step forward. And then Lavrov proceeded as follows. They, that is to say, Waltz and Trump, alluded to the Kiev regime's induction into NATO, contravening agreements made through Soviet and subsequently Russian-American dialogues, as well as within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. These agreements, reached by consensus at the highest level and endorsed by presidents, including President Barack Obama in 2010, stipulated that no nation or organization within the OSCE should seek dominance, nor should any nation bolster its security at the expense of others. Yet, NATO has pursued precisely what it vowed not to do, as Donald Trump has pointed out. In other words, the problem is NATO expansion, and Trump recognizes the fact. And then Lavrov goes on to say what a tremendous change this is. This marks the first occasion an American, and indeed any Western leader, has openly acknowledged that NATO was disingenuous when it signed numerous accords with our country and within the OSCE. These agreements served merely as a facade, a piece of paper, while in practice NATO has advanced towards our borders, infringing upon the terms under which East Germany integrated into the Federal Republic. This includes advancing military infrastructure near our borders and planning military bases, including naval bases in Crimea and on the Sea of Azov. These facts are well documented. Now, Lavrov is stretching things here. Trump did not quite say all of these things. He did say that he understands that for the Russians, NATO membership for Ukraine is a red line, and he says that he understands why the Russians would feel, how the Russians feel about how NATO was how they would feel about NATO being parked literally on their front door. But he didn't go all the way to say that the whole process of NATO eastward expansion after 1991 was the problem. At least I've never seen any comments by Trump which go into that level of detail. But it is nonetheless the case that Trump's acknowledgement that the issue of NATO is the central problem does represent a historic break. And though, as I said, Lavrov is stretching it, he's not in some respects stretching it that far. And anyway, then Lavrov went on to say this: the fact that this root cause is finally being incorporated into the American narrative after months, if not years, of our reminders is indeed positive. However, the narrative and the discourse is at large have yet to address the rights of Russians, whose language, culture, education, media, and canonical religion have been legally prohibited in Ukraine. Meaningful discussions cannot occur if the West continues to feign normalcy on this issue. And then Lavrov goes on to discuss, and has discussed in many places over the course of this press conference, that there are many problems that are faced, but he is here recognizing that Trump's words about NATO and Walz's words represent a conceptual breakthrough, and that they do represent a pathway, perhaps not to peace in Ukraine itself, we'll come to that shortly, but at least towards a better understanding between the Russians and the Americans, and perhaps as a result of that understanding to the achievement of some sort of peace in Europe. And then Lavrov says, we await specific initiatives. President Putin has consistently expressed his willingness to meet, yet no proposals have emerged thus far. Subsequently, President Trump stated that Putin is keen to meet with him. I concur that a meeting is essential, but first it is imperative for Trump to take office. Now, Lavrov said much else over this very interesting press conference. He made it fairly clear that, as far as I can see, if we're talking about security guarantees for Ukraine, these are security guarantees that must be made within the context of a re-examination of the entire security system in Europe. And he said this: President Putin spoke in this room in the Foreign Ministry about Russia's stance on Ukraine settlement on June 14th. In other words, June 14th, 2024. In other words, the Russians are not moving an inch from the position that Putin set out over that speech. And Lavrov spells it out again, under which the issue of Ukraine's accession to NATO must be taken off the table. Russian speakers' language, religious and other rights, which Zelensky's regime has outlawed, must be restored. In this room, he also spoke about the importance of creating a Eurasian architecture, which, just like the African Union and CELAC, should be open to all countries on the continent. The discussion of these ideas has been ongoing for about 10 years since President Putin advanced the Greater Eurasian Partnership Initiative at the first Russia-Asia ASEAN summit. Relevant agreements have been signed between the SCO, the EAEU, that's the Eurasian Economic Union, which the Russians lead, and ASEAN. We are now coordinating the issue with the Cooperation Council of the Arab States of the Gulf, which is a new disclosure, by the way. When we say that this economic, transport and logistics partnership must be open to all countries on the continent, we also include the western part of the continent in, etc., etc. And then he talks a great deal about that. And then he says that the agreements clearly have to cover security issues, including the question of Ukraine. And there are two aspects of security: the threats at our western borders, which are one of the biggest original causes of the conflict, must be eliminated. This can only be achieved in the context of broader agreements. We are ready to discuss security guarantees for a country that is now called Ukraine. That is a very interesting form of words. Or for the part of this country that remains undecided in terms of self-determination, unlike Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya. Again, a very interesting form of words. As important as this aspect is, the Eurasian context will dominate because the western part of the continent cannot shut itself off from giants like China, India, Russia, the Persian Gulf, and the entire South Asia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So hundreds of millions of people populate this region. We must develop the continent to ensure that the issue of its central part, the Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Far East, the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, are handled by countries of this region rather than by former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who said that NATO should operate there because the alliance's security depends on the Indo-Pacific region. Well, I'm not going to go into some of these wider comments that Lavrov is talking about, but he's talking about new security arrangements for Europe, but these must be Eurasian security agreements. They must look at security across the entire Eurasian territory, not just Europe, not just Russia, not just Ukraine, but China, India, the Gulf states as well, apparently. And the security guarantees for Ukraine, or as he put it, the country that is now called Ukraine, or the part of this country that remains undecided in terms of self-determination. Any security guarantees for whatever remains, that can only be negotiated and agreed within the context of this gigantic new security construction. Now, I have to say, this is an impossibly ambitious agenda that Lavrov is outlining here. I assume that to some extent this is a negotiating position. I cannot seriously believe that even Lavrov believes that security agreements essential to achieve a settlement in Ukraine can somehow be linked to settlement, say, of the crisis in Taiwan. I think this is beyond the reach of any statesman today, and it would certainly be beyond the reach of Donald Trump to navigate it through the Senate in the United States. Trade-offs of this kind are simply impossible. But in some respects, even if we look at it in that way, consider what Lavrov is in effect saying. He's saying that, yes, we can move forward with a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. We do, however, need to look again at the whole security situation in Europe, but that has to be in a Eurasian context, and the Ukrainian conflict needs to be understood in a Eurasian context as well. I can't help but think that what Lavrov here is signalling is that one Eurasian country in particular must have a say, and that Eurasian country is China. That just as guarantees are going to be provided to Ukraine, with China being one of the guarantors, guarantees will have to be provided also to Russia, and China will be one of the guarantors again. China, in other words, will become a direct participant in security arrangements in Europe. Now, I think, again, just to repeat, I think that is going to be a very hard sell for anyone in the United States to take back home and to propose to Congress, just saying. But I do think that this is a genuine trend in world affairs. China is now a superpower, just like the United States is, just as it looks likely that Russia soon will once again be. And given that China is a superpower, and given that it is part of the Eurasian world, of which Russia is also a part, it is logical that the Chinese would have a say in what goes on in European affairs also. Just over a year ago, when the Chinese were first floating ideas about settlements of the conflict in Ukraine, where when President Xi Jinping of China first appointed an envoy, Li Hui, to look at the situation in Ukraine and to see whether any kind of process of negotiation might take place, facilitated by China, I said that this was a dramatic event, that it represented the entry of China into European affairs, as dramatic in some respects as the entry of the United States into European security and diplomacy in the first half of the 20th century. And, well, we are not quite there yet, but it looks as if we are moving slowly, or perhaps not so slowly, in that direction. Now, as I said, Lavrov had a lot more to say. He spoke absolutely scathingly about the Germans and the French. He spoke about the betrayal that the Russians feel in relation to the Germans and the French, about the Minsk agreement. He says that Merkel and Hollande in Minsk in February 2015 gave the Russians categorical promises that they would act as guarantors of the Minsk agreement that had been agreed then, and that they reneged on that promise and made it fairly clear afterwards that they were pulling the wool over the Russians' eyes and never had any serious intention to see Minsk done at all. I think Lavrov, by the way, here may be a little too hard on the Germans and the French, at least on Merkel. But I can entirely understand why the Russians feel that. I think the Russians have come to the view that Donald Trump understands them in a way that no other post-Cold War Western leader has done. I think that there is serious goodwill to him now in Moscow, because he's been prepared to make that conceptual break with all that has been said before. But the Russians, as Lavrov went out of his way to say, are waiting for specific proposals, and they don't trust the West 1 inch. And as for the Europeans, they have no time for them at all. And they've made that completely clear. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, Lavrov's former colleague, Putin's former national security advisor, Nikolai Patrushev, still a member of Russia's Security Council, still influential in Russian politics, he said that the Europeans should be excluded from all negotiations entirely. Anyway, the thing to take away from this is that the Russians are keeping the door open. They're waiting for Trump. They're waiting to see what he will come with, but they have absolutely noticed what he said. Now let's move on and discuss what others are saying and doing. Just before I did this program, I saw that the current Ukrainian Foreign Minister has just come out with a statement in which he says that Zelensky's decree prohibiting direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia remains in effect, and that there is no plan or intention to set it aside. So there we are. The Russians have said they are welcoming Donald Trump. They've repeatedly said that they're prepared to sit down and to negotiate with the Ukrainians. Perhaps because the Ukrainians have been unsettled by all of these moves that the Americans, Trump that's to say, and the Russians are taking towards each other. The Ukrainians are ostentatiously and noisily slamming the door. And incredibly, there are Western politicians who continue to urge them on in that direction. Now, Prime Minister Starmer of Great Britain, my Prime Minister, it has just been to Ukraine, where apparently he intends to sign, and perhaps as of the time of the appearance of this program, has already signed a 100-year agreement with Ukraine, a 100-year agreement between Britain and Ukraine, which apparently will include security cooperation. I mean, at this time, when Ukraine is being defeated on the battlefields, when the Americans and the Russians are about to start talks, when the new US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the man who's waiting to be confirmed, has actually just gone forward and said that it is completely unrealistic of Ukraine to think that it can ever regain its territories and that the war needs to end, and that the only way to end the war, to stress it again, as Trump has hinted when he said that it's up to Putin, the only way to end the war is on the basis of something which the Russians are happy with. Just saying. Despite all of that, Keir Starmer goes along, he disregards all of this, he continues with all the rhetoric, the British government continues with all the rhetoric about Russia, aggression, all of that, and he's going to sign an agreement for 100 years with a country which Lavrov has just said is the country which is now called Ukraine, which Patrushev yesterday said might not exist, continue to exist beyond the end of this year. Starmer apparently believes that he can sign a document with that country in that kind of crisis and achieve what by doing so? Well, the only thing he's going to achieve is lead the Ukrainians further up the garden path, make the Ukrainians think that perhaps they have more support in Europe than they perhaps actually do, make the Ukrainians think that the Europeans can somehow bring the Americans back into line. That kind of rhetoric, that kind of approach, at this point, in my opinion, is a disaster. Is disastrous for Ukraine. Ukraine has been led from one disaster to another, and Starmer appears intent to lead it further along that path towards its ultimate destruction. And, well, he's not the only one. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, has made a further series of incredible speeches. He is going even beyond Stoltenberg now. He talks about how all of the nations of Europe face an existential threat, how it's important not to overlook how important Ukraine is, how if that were to happen, the Europeans would face some kind of extraordinary disaster, that the important thing, therefore, continues to be to get behind Ukraine, to go on supporting Ukraine in order eventually, presumably, to put it in some kind of stronger position, which 3 years of war have failed to achieve. Instead, Ukraine's position grows weaker and weaker. I can't help but get the view that the true purpose of people like Starmer and Rutte, and by the way Macron and others, is not to facilitate a negotiation to end the war in Ukraine. It is to prevent any kind of rapprochement between the Americans and the Russians at all. I've discussed why in many programs, that the Europeans, especially now, when Donald Trump is talking about spheres of influence, when we are entering into a more multipolar system, as Trump appears to recognize, when Trump administration officials like Eldridge Colby and others are talking about the Europeans having to acknowledge that the United States is going to refocus on Europe, that the Europeans, their overriding intention is to still keep the United States locked in Europe, and that they're trying to use the conflict in Ukraine in order to achieve that, to build up the Russian bogey, to pretend that Russia really is some kind of overwhelming existential threat, not just to them, but ultimately to the entire position of the United States, and to keep the Americans in. Well, according to Bloomberg, sources in the United States are saying that Donald Trump himself doesn't consider Ukraine existentially important, ultimately even at all important to the United States. He doesn't believe that American interests are directly engaged in Ukraine. He thinks that the United States has more important things to worry about. In my opinion, by the way, he is right about all of those things, and he should stick to that position. He is more likely to achieve peace in Ukraine and peace in Europe if he does than if he listens to these siren voices coming from Macron, Rutte, others, Starmer, Zelensky himself, than if he sticks by his own instincts and listens to the advice of people like Colby and others. Anyway, we will see what happens. We have to wait until the inauguration. At that point, I expect Kellogg or maybe Rubio to travel to Moscow. The ice between the Americans and the Russians will be broken, and talks between the Russians and the Americans can begin, and a meeting between Trump and Putin can be arranged. And hopefully it will happen quickly. As I've said already, I don't myself believe it can happen in Europe for all kinds of reasons, even in friendly countries like Serbia or Slovakia or Hungary. I think it is more likely to happen perhaps in Doha, in Qatar, or in the UAE, maybe in Dubai, or perhaps, as Lavrov is now suggesting, in Vietnam, which would be an interesting venue, by the way, given past history and given the fact that Vietnam was also once a battleground in which Russia and America, through proxies, dueled with each other. Just saying. But anyway, there we are. We will see what happens, and some kind of negotiations between the Americans and the Russians no doubt will continue. Meanwhile, the war goes on. I'm not going to continue this at the moment, for the moment, and this certainly not in this program. I'm not going to provide any further detailed analysis of what has happened. Suffice to say, in every place, the Russians continue to advance. The situation in the Kupiansk area getting particularly difficult. It looks as it does. We get further confirmation of more Russian advances in the Torets, Chasiv Yar area too, and there appears to be a major battle underway for Velikaya Novosilka, and it looks like that small town is about to fall. Literally, I've seen pictures showing dramatic footage of explosions in the town, which look like a clear sign of a Russian storming operation. And the Russians have increased their foothold west of Pokrovsk. There are reports that they not only have cut the roads to Pokrovsk, the westward roads to Pokrovsk, but that they have now entered the village of Kotlino and that fighting is taking place there. So the battles continue. But in the meantime, the Ukrainians continue to make their own geopolitical position worse. A couple of days ago, during the big Ukrainian missile and drone strike on Russia, the one in which the Russians claim to have shot down 6 ATACMS and 8 Storm Shadow missiles, the Ukrainians also launched a drone attack on a transfer station inside Russia, which services the Turk Stream pipeline. Now, the Russians have publicly accused the United States of being a party to this attack. Whether or not that is true, the Turks have also said that this attack on this station did indeed potentially affect the Turk Stream pipeline, though as in the event it was not damaged. Now, I can remember about a year ago reports circulating that the Ukrainians had indeed attempted some kind of attacks on Turk Stream. There were Russian ships patrolling the Turk Stream pipes in the Black Sea, and some of those ships also came under Ukrainian attack, though all of those attacks appear to have been unsuccessful. But I also recall that a couple of months ago, some papers purportedly from Ukraine were published which showed a major internal row going on within Ukraine, with some officials questioning these attacks on the Turk Stream pipeline, saying that they were an incredibly stupid thing to do, because Erdogan, who had up to that time shown some sympathy for Ukraine, would never forgive an attack, a sustained attack on Turk Stream. Well, someone in Kiev, perhaps backed by someone in Washington, has now decided to throw all of those concerns to one side, and they're going ahead with attacks on the Turk Stream pipes. Meanwhile, even as the European Union assured us that there is nothing to worry about when the Ukrainians switched off the taps, switched off the pipes supplying Russian gas to Europe. Meanwhile, gas prices across Europe continue to rise. I spoke yesterday about how Prime Minister Mitsotakis of Greece was sending letters to EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, expressing concerns about this, though offering no ideas about how that problem was going to be addressed. Well, I now read that the situation with the European storage facilities is getting ever more serious. We're told that there's only 70 billion cubic meters of gas left in European storage. That's only enough for around 70 days at current rates of consumption. There are particular problems in certain other countries. Slovakia, however, has perhaps enough gas stored for 100 days. Austria, perhaps for a similar amount. Italy, even more. But other countries, Germany presumably, Britain definitely, are in a significantly worse position. And it seems there are now also problems with supplies of gas from Azerbaijan. It seems that there's been an emergency situation with an underground pipe which is part of the Shah Deniz project, which has reduced the supply of Azerbaijani gas to the border of Turkey and Europe by 30%. Presumably this is a Caspian Sea pipeline. So it looks as if volumes in the situation with gas storage is not perfect in Europe by any means. Now, yesterday there were reports in the Russian media that some kind of agreement had been reached whereby the Russians would supply gas to Transnistria, averting the crisis there, and that this would be supplied on a humanitarian basis. What I presume this amounts to is that the Russians are going to send gas through the Ukrainian pipelines for no fee. The Russians will not require payment for this gas, and this presumably in some way will circumvent the issue with transit contracts. I don't know how this is going to be done. I'm not sure that it can be done at all. But otherwise, the situation with gas transportation in Europe remains critical, and surprise, surprise, energy prices across Europe are now rising, and this is causing more pressure on the European economies. But the European Union continues to be unconcerned. They have made no statements of concern about this Ukrainian attack on the Turk Stream pipeline on one of its stations on Russian territory. It's not registered with them. They've backed the latest oil sanctions that the Biden administration has issued against Russia. The word in the markets, incidentally, is that the markets expect that the Trump people anyway are going to slow walk them. There seems to be astonishing insouciance about this whole question of energy. And to the extent that there is a problem, it's being attributed to acts of God, things that are outside European control. I'm going to give an example. There is today a huge article in the Financial Times discussing the economic decline of Germany over the period of Olaf Scholz's chancellorship. And Well, it contains some truly astonishing statements. It says, for example, that some of the headwinds that Germany has suffered, including the energy price shock after Russia invaded Ukraine and slower world trade, were out of Berlin's control. Out of Berlin's control. Suspending the operation of Nord Stream 2, looking the other way as the Nord Stream pipelines are blown up, cancelling further imports of gas and oil from Russia, tearing up all the contracts. All of that, apparently it's all out of Berlin's and presumably Brussels' control. It's all just things that had happened. No one can take responsibility for them, not even Olaf Scholz. I wonder how long this delusion will last. At least with Donald Trump, he is starting to tear away the delusions. He's no longer saying that the conflict in Ukraine and NATO have nothing to do with each other. He's no longer pretending that the territories in eastern Ukraine can be recovered by Ukraine, Donbass, Crimea, and all of that. As we see in Europe, and unfortunately in Ukraine as well, we all continue to live inside our own fantasies. Well, this is where I finish today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.